So far, the key here is to realize that these problems are not overly complicated. However, if you don't take the time to carefully set up your initial equations, it's going to throw off your entire problem. So the math itself is something that we did in the last section. It's not overly complicated. It is detailed and time consuming. However, the hard part is always going to be making sure you set up those equations correctly. Here are two more examples. Now we're going to start seeing some examples that you would see in, let's say, a science class. I'm going to see if I can draw some pictures to help us out. It says, how many liters of each do we need? We've got a 15% acid and a 33% acid that are going to get mixed together to create something in the middle, a 21% acid, but we want something really specific. We want exactly 120 liters of whatever kind of acid I want in the end. So the idea is I'm going to be pouring amounts together to get something in the end. So here's my first things that I'm starting out with. And I'm going to mix these together. Because I'm mixing them together, it means I am adding them together to get, which means what I want them to equal, is going to be on the other side. Well, what do I know about the first amount? Well, if I look at this problem, the first amount, the only thing I know about is that it's a 15% acid. So because we never use percentages as percentages in word problems, I'm going to go ahead and convert that into a decimal, which means either move the decimal place 2 places or divide by 100, which will get you 0.15. Now notice they don't tell you how much of this acid you're going to use. You're going to have to figure that out, so we'll call that our X value, the first thing we don't know. Reading along, the second amount they mention is a 33% acid. Again, not going to use them as percentages, so we'll turn that into a decimal by dividing by 100 or moving the decimal place 2 places to the left, which will give us 0.33. Notice, however, again, they don't tell us how much of this we're going to use. But it's not the same thing. It's something else. It's not the same thing as the 15%, so I'm going to use a new letter, Y. Now what we want these to mix up or combine together to become is a 21% acid on the other side. And so again, we're not going to use it as a percentage. We'll turn it into a decimal by dividing by 100 or moving the decimal place 2 places. And that will get us a 0.21 or 20 from the 21%. Now this one is the one they did tell us how much we're going to want of the final product. They told us 120 liters. So that's what I'll put at the bottom, 120, and L for liters. So I have my picture set up. I should be able to come up with 2 equations from this picture. So the first one is actually rather straightforward. The first equation that we're going to come up with is going to be however much of the 15% acid combined with or added with however much of the 33% acid should give us however much we end up with in the end, which is a total of 120 liters. So that's our first equation. X plus Y equals 120. Okay, so that was our easy equation. The second equation still isn't bad, but it's going to be a little bit more involved because it's going to use the one thing we haven't touched yet, which are those percentages as decimals. So let's take a look at how we're going to do this. So if we want to use our percentages as decimals, remember what you do with your percentages. You multiply them when they're a decimal times however much of whatever it is you have, which means I should take my 0.15 times how much of the 15% acid, which will be my X. So that means I'm going to start out with 0.15X. And then I've got my plus, just reading it from left to right. Then I've got my 33%, and how much of that times how much I need of that, which is my Y. So 33, the 0.33 times the Y. Now I've got my equals, Now let's go to the last piece. Now I've got my 0.21 or 21% times, be careful, however much of that I'm going to use, which is, they gave me a number for that, so times 120. So there is actually a little bit of math I need to do. Is this one I can actually multiply out. The 21% of the 0.21 or 21% of the 120, which will give me, for this value, 25.2. Now, if you remember back from the first test, is that you may not have liked decimals. And if you're one of those people who did not like decimals, you could get rid of them. We talked about how to get rid of decimals is that you can multiply an entire equation by either 10, 100, 1,000. Well, let's do that. To get rid of all the decimals, well, we need to get rid of 2 here, 2 here, 1 here. So if I only get rid of 1, that's not enough. I need to get rid of 2 decimal places on everything because I have to be consistent. Let's multiply the entire equation by 100 to move everything 2 decimal places. So what that will turn into is 15x plus 33y equals, be careful, on the 25.2, it's still going to move that 2 decimal places, so that will be 2520. Okay, so that gets us one equation. Notice our other equation, the first one, which we haven't touched yet, has the x and y on the same side as well. So this might be easier to just go ahead and do this by elimination. So let's go ahead and do that, do something different. So let's take our top equation, and to do elimination, I've already got a 15x that's positive, so I would need a negative 15x for something to eliminate, so I'll multiply that whole equation by a negative 15. So that'll give me a negative 15x, a negative 15y, and 15 times 120 is going to give me a negative 1800 on the other side. Now I can go ahead and add these normally so I can eliminate. The x's and y's will eliminate, and then I've got my 33 minus my, so I've got my 33 minus my 15 for my y's, which will give me 18y equals, then I've got my 2520 minus my 1800, which will give me 720. So my last step here will be divide both sides by 18. So dividing by 18 gets me that y equals 40. The question is, what is y? Well, this is why I love drawing pictures. I can go back up to my picture and find where my y goes. So up here on the top, let's see, let's take this y up to the top. That's the amount of 33% solution because the 0.33 is in the box. So, and this is a total of how much? 40 liters, because our total amount had to be in liters as well. So that's only part of my answer. I also need to know how much of the other amount, how much of the 15% I'm going to need. Well, remember, they have to add up to our total, which was 120. Well, if we already know the 33% is 40, then it must be that the 15%, because they have to add up to 120, had to be the other 80 liters, because then 80 plus 40 will give you the 120. So that means that the 15%, for the 15% acid, will use 80 liters. If you really weren't sure, what you could have done just to make your life a little bit easier is taken this y equals 40 and just plugged it in up top, and you could have solved that first equation for x by subtracting 40 from both sides. And notice you do get 120 minus 40, which is 80. But it's really up to you on how you do these. Now let's try